Hey everyone, grab a cookie and a coffee or a tea because I've tested no less than 50 games on the brand new ASUS ROG Xbox LIX with the Ryzen AI Z2 Extreme, 24GB of RAM and a 120Hz Full HD Adaptive Sync display. And this time I actually tested all games with 3 to 4 different performance modes TDP-wise. 13W, which is the silent mode, 17W performance mode and the plugged-in 35W turbo mode to see the maximum performance possible on this machine as well. As this took like forever, with over 160 recorded gameplay files, I'd be super thankful if you'd consider liking the video for the algorithm to push it a little. Thank you so much. Unfortunately, recording reduced the FPS by about 1–3% despite me using an external capture card, so keep that in mind as well. At 100 FPS that's about 1–3 FPS, at 50 FPS about 2 FPS and at 30 FPS around 1 FPS more without recording. Also keep in mind that on battery 25W is the maximum TDP, which will have a performance closer to 35W plugged in than to 17W. I also made a few exceptions with lighter games for which I included a manually set 7W profile, which is the minimum TDP you can set in the Xbox LIX's Armory Crate SE software. And some lighter games have only been tested at 7W and 13W since that already provided more than enough performance. Though a 7W TDP can lead to unforeseen issues with textures and objects not loading in more advanced games despite frame times around 30 FPS or more. The different TDP settings will of course have a major impact on the battery run times. At 7W you'll get around 6.2 hours of battery life. Around 4.5 hours using the silent mode with 13W, 2.9 hours using the performance mode with its 17W and pretty close to 2 hours using the highest turbo mode. Of course, these numbers can slightly vary depending on the game, display brightness, audio volume, Wi-Fi signal and optional FPS caps, but it'll give you a good idea of what to expect. Now for today's test I had to use the only available BIOS and driver versions during the NDA/embargo period, but since the Radeon 890M in the Z2 Extreme already has been around for some time, the drivers should be pretty mature already. Though that's not the case for the BIOS of the ASUS ROG Xbox LIX, so I'm pretty confident we will see some kind of performance improvements in the near future, just like with the previous ASUS ROG LIX and the original ROG Ally. Nonetheless, I really hope that the video is going to cover some of your favorite games. I try to reproduce the same gameplay as good as possible or use integrated benchmarks for better comparability, while I use the native 1080p resolution in basically all games and FSR in most cases when it was available, as that just makes more sense than using 720p in the first place in my opinion. The small 7-inch screen definitely hides a lot of FSR artifacts. Oh, and FrameGen was turned off in basically every game, with 1 or 2 exceptions where I mention it. The VRAM pre-allocation was set to 8GB for all of today's tested games, which still leaves us with 16GB of RAM for the system and the games. Oh, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss my direct comparison of the Xbox LIX with the original ASUS ROG Ally 1 from 2023 soon. And now without further ado, let's just jump right into the alphabetically ordered benchmarks and feel free to use the timestamps/timeline for navigation.
The first game for today is Alan Wake 2 at 1080p with the low preset and FSR on quality. For the 13W profile I saw 22 FPS on average, 32 FPS for the 17W performance mode and 42 on average for the turbo profile plugged in. While again, the 25W turbo profile when the Xbox LIX is on battery is very close to that. However, in this game you'd definitely need to pick at least a performance profile for playable FPS with these lower settings, as the game is very demanding for the GPU. Apex Legends is running much smoother with 74 FPS on average for the 13W silent profile and 97 FPS for the performance profile, while I already saw 136 FPS for the 35W turbo mode. The 1% lows have been pretty good as well, though keep in mind, I used a predefined route in the shooting range and actual gameplay could be a bit lower FPS wise. But it's definitely going to be playable just fine even with the 13W silent profile on the Xbox LIX and the Z2 Extreme. For Ark Survival Evolved, I was using the medium preset at 1080p, which is pretty demanding for an older single player title. Only 24 FPS on average for the 13W silent mode, 34 FPS for the 17W performance mode, and only slightly higher 39 FPS for the 35W turbo mode when plugged in. I mean, it is playable, but probably using the low preset would be a good idea here. Also, very similar FPS for Assassin's Creed Shadows, even with the low preset and FSR set to performance even. Only 24 FPS on average for the 13W profile, which is unplayable. 31 FPS for the performance mode and 38 FPS on average for the turbo mode. So here using something between 17 and 25W would definitely be recommended. For Shadows, I also tried out FrameGen with the same settings, which resulted in an average of around 68 FPS and 1% loss of 46. Now the game definitely looks smoother that way, though you can definitely feel the additional input lag here, so probably not that recommendable in this case. Compared to that, Assassin's Creed Valhalla is a lightweight, since with 1080p and medium settings, without any upscaling whatsoever, it ran so much better. 37 FPS on average for the 13W profile, already somewhat playable, 45 FPS for the 17W performance mode, and 53 FPS on average for the 35W turbo mode plugged in. And here you can definitely get even higher FPS with the low preset or using 720p instead, which still looks somewhat decent on a 7-inch screen in my opinion, since we're not using upscaling here. Then again, Avowed is super demanding on recent PC hardware and especially on iGPUs like the Radeon 890M. Only 23 FPS on average at 1080p in low settings, plus FSR on balanced with the 13W silent mode. 30 FPS with the 17W performance mode, while that is the absolute minimum you'd want, and 40 FPS with the turbo mode. I mean, without recording, it's probably 1 to 2 FPS more, but that doesn't change that much here really. As Baldurs Gate 3 doesn't have real-time fights, lower FPS aren't that much of a problem here. 24 FPS on average with the 13W silent mode, 33 FPS with the 17W performance mode, and 42 FPS with the turbo mode, while the tested scene in Act 3 is one of the most demanding ones in the game, and in many cases you'd surely get higher FPS on the ROG Xbox LIX. For Battlefield 2042, I was using the low preset at 1080p, which resulted in the following numbers: 40 FPS on average for the 13W silent mode, 45 FPS for the 17W performance mode, and 61 FPS for the 35W turbo mode, while for all three of them the frame times haven't been as flat as I hoped for. But one way or another it is playable, and 900p or even 720p still are an option here, as there was no upscaling involved. The multiplayer part of Call of Duty Black Ops 6 was running a bit better than Battlefield, using the basic preset with FSR on quality at 1080p. 36 FPS on average for the lowest silent mode, already playable somewhat. 52 FPS on average for the 17W performance mode, and pretty decent 74 FPS on average for the highest 35W turbo mode plugged in. Interestingly, the GPU's boost clock is quite low here, with only around 1800 MHz in turbo mode, as the chip has to put more power to the CPU in this title. And basically the same FPS for Warzone when I was using identical settings. 36 FPS for the lowest 13W silent mode, 52 FPS on average with a 17W TDP, and 75 FPS for the highest profile, while without recording that would be more like 77 FPS. And for the two higher modes, the frame times have been quite nice and flat most of the time really. For Cyberpunk 2077, I was actually using the medium preset with FSR on quality to see what is possible here. The 13W silent mode didn't quite hit the 30 FPS mark with only 29 FPS on average, while with the 17W profile it was already at 40 FPS on average. And 53 FPS with the turbo mode, while in that case frame generation actually starts to make some sense in a single player game, and Cyberpunk 2077 is a bit slower overall. The Crash Bandicoot remake ran great even with the highest insane preset at 1080p, while I also tested the game at only 7W using 720p with low settings instead. So for this 7 watt mode, I was getting playable 39 FPS on average at 720p low. The 13 watt profile at 1080p and insane settings resulted in 44 FPS on average, great 64 FPS for the 17 watt profile and 70 FPS for the turbo mode. And keep in mind, with the 7 watt profile, you could play this game for 6 hours on the Xbox LIX. CS2 ran decent on all 3 presets at 1080p and low settings, while FSR was turned on. 104 FPS on average for the 13 watt profile, 120 FPS for the 17 watt profile and 141 FPS on average for the 35 watt profile. Not much to see here despite the usual behavior of CS2 with its bad 1% lows that you won't notice and the fact that neither CPU nor GPU get fully utilized. I didn't care comparing Dave the Diver since it already hit the 60 FPS cap using the 13 watt mode at 1080p and was perfectly playable as you can see here. And even with the 7 watt profile you can play the game for 6 hours if you're okay with 720p and 57 FPS on average. Still perfectly playable and fine on the 7-inch display, while this is a great game to play mobile for sure. Diablo 4 ran perfectly fine as well at 1080p with medium settings and FSR on quality, which looks pretty decent on the Xbox LIX. 44 FPS for the 13 watt silent mode, 59 FPS on average for the 17 watt profile, which would be more like 60 to 61 FPS without recording, and 66 FPS for the highest turbo profile. While all of them provided decent 1% lows, so nothing to complain here really. Let's have a look at the next game. To be honest, Elden Ring was a bit disappointing at 1080p and low settings as I was expecting more here. And it was a bit harder to get the game to run as I had to deactivate the online mode for some reason, otherwise it would crash on startup. However, using the 13 watt mode I saw an average of 31 FPS and 38 FPS for the 17 watt performance mode as well as 47 FPS for the 35 watt mode. So for a stable 60 FPS you'd actually have to choose 720p instead in this case, which is kinda recommended I guess. F125 ran fine with medium settings and FSR on quality. 43 FPS for the 13 watt mode, already perfectly playable. 61 FPS on average for the 17 watt profile with great 1% lows and even much better 79 FPS for the highest 35 watt turbo mode when plugged in. Not much to complain about here, so let's have a look at the next game. Again, for a lighter game like Fallguys, I didn't need to test above the 13 watt profile as that already did hit the 60 FPS cap at high settings and 1080p. Perfectly playable. And still pretty decent 56 FPS on average using the 7 watt profile at 720p with low settings if you really need the 6 hours of battery runtime instead of the 3.5 hours for the 13 watt profile. The benchmark of Far Cry 6 ran with an average of 38 FPS using the 13 watt mode at 1080p and medium settings. While the 17 watt mode already got me pretty good 51 FPS on average and 60 FPS on average for the 35 watt turbo profile. And well, there is some headroom using either low settings or reducing the resolution to 720p in this case, which as mentioned is still acceptable on this small 7-inch Full HD screen. FC25 was playable just fine on all 3 performance modes using medium settings at 1080p. Around 40 FPS on average with the 13 watt silent mode and 3.5 hours of battery runtime. 53 FPS on average for the 17 watt profile, which would result in around 2.9 hours, and a high 77 FPS on average if you'd be using the 35 watt turbo mode, which on battery would actually be 25 watt with around 2 hours runtime with basically the same performance. For Fortnite, I was once more using the 7 watt manual profile as well, again with 720p and the lowest settings. For the rest, I was using 1080p in the game's performance mode with high settings. So for the 7 watt profile, I saw an average of 68 FPS, but the 1% lows haven't been great with only 30 FPS. For the 13 watt mode, I already saw very playable 88 FPS on average, probably 90 without recording, and 108 FPS for the 17 watt mode, while the 35 watt turbo mode scored a much higher 143 FPS on average here. And in case you wonder, I was using a rendered replay for a better comparison here. And in Forza Horizon 5, I was using the 7W profile as well at 720p with low settings, which resulted in 32 FPS on average. Though there can be texture loading issues in this case, so I would recommend the 13W profile at 1080p and medium settings instead, which already gave me 48 FPS on average without any issues. 60 FPS for the 17W performance mode, and 73 FPS on average for the 35W turbo mode, where you could probably get away with 60 FPS on high settings instead. For God of War 1, I was using the original preset, which resembles the experience on the PS4, while I was also using FSR on quality. With the 13W silent mode, I was getting 33 FPS on average, 44 FPS for the 17W performance mode, and 48 FPS for the 35W turbo mode. It's not perfect, while it's playable, and you'll have some headroom left with lower settings or stronger FSR. And for GTA 5, I was once more adding the 7W profile at 720p with low settings. That got me around 33 FPS on average, while that was already 46 FPS for the 13W profile at much higher 1080p and the high preset in combination with FSR on quality. And for the 17W performance mode, I already saw 60 FPS on average and 75 FPS on average for the highest 35W turbo mode plugged in. So that's definitely going to be just perfectly fine and enjoyable on the ASUS Xbox LIX. Hades is another easy to run indie game, and I already saw an average of around 253 FPS for the 13W silent mode at 1080p, so I also fired up the manual 7W profile, which still gave me 89 FPS on average at 720p, and thus resulting in a potential 6 hours of battery runtime. I was testing Helldivers 2 at 1080p with the low preset and quality resolution scaling. Already 40 FPS on average for the 13W silent profile, 53 FPS on average for the 17W profile, and very playable 64 FPS on average for the 35W turbo mode. While I wouldn't exactly love that on a big screen, it's once again fine on the Xbox LIX's 7-inch display. For Hogwarts Legacy, I was using my usual walk through the Forbidden Forest, this time backwards. At 1080p and the medium preset, including FSR on quality, that resulted in 30 FPS on average for the 13W profile, 38 FPS for the 17W performance profile, and 44 FPS for the 35W profile. Now, once more, you do have headroom, either using low settings or a stronger FSR mode, and with a combination of both, you could probably hit the very holy 60 FPS mark. The popular Hollow Knight Silksong runs perfectly fine on the Xbox LIX with the 13W silent mode already, 191 FPS on average at 1080p, and even with my manual 7W profile, it scored 92 FPS at 720p with stable frame times, so no need to test the other profiles in this case. For Hunt Showdown, I was using the low preset at 1080p with FSR on balanced, and already saw a decent 53 FPS on average using the lowest 13W silent mode with a good 1% lows, already way over 60 FPS for the very useful 17W performance mode, and 82 FPS on average for the turbo mode. And I can confirm these numbers for an actual multiplayer game and not just this little part in the tutorial. Indiana Jones and the Great Circle is one of the most demanding titles of today's tested games, and with low settings at 1080p and FSR on balanced, it achieved 27 FPS on average at 13W, 34 FPS on average at 17W, and 43 FPS at 35W. So the difference between the profiles hasn't been as big as with other titles we already saw. And look at that VRAM utilization even with low settings and FSR activated, already pretty close to 8GB of VRAM. For Kingdom Come Deliverance 2, I chose the medium preset at 1080p with FSR on quality, cause I just like how good the game looks. But that only allowed for 23 FPS on average using the 13W silent mode, already 36 FPS on average for the 17W performance mode, and 46 FPS using the turbo mode. So Something between 17 and 25 watt should do it, and alternatively, you can use the low preset or stronger FSR for more performance, but it is playable either way. Marvel Rivals was getting playable FPS at 1080p with the low preset and FSR on balanced, 45 FPS for the 13 watt silent mode, 57 FPS on average for the 17 watt performance mode, and already 73 FPS on average for the turbo mode. You could get a bit more performance with even lower settings, but the game would surely get a bit muddier doing so. I was also quickly testing Minecraft at 1080p using the Vibrant Visuals preset with favor to performance. In this theme I got 27 FPS on average, though that one was at 720p for the 7 watt profile, 58 FPS on average for the 13 watt profile at 1080p, 74 FPS on average for the 17 watt profile, and 90 FPS using the turbo mode. So depending on the game's version and what mods you're planning to use, yes, it will run just fine. I mean, it's an 8-core 16-thread CPU with 24GB of RAM after all. Also, No Man's Sky seemed to run fine at 1080p with the standard graphic preset in combination with FSR on quality. Performance surely depends a lot on the planet, and you'd get higher FPS in space. Already very playable 50 FPS on average with the 13 watt silent mode, 60 FPS with the 17 watt performance mode, and 75 FPS on average using the 35 watt turbo mode. So it's just running fine, and let's jump right to the next game, which is Oblivion Remastered. Again, one of the most demanding games of this video. At 1080p and the low preset with FSR on balanced, I only saw 29 FPS on average for the 13 watt profile, 34 FPS on average for the 17 watt profile, and only slightly more 41 FPS on average for the 35 watt profile. So 60 FPS is still quite far away, and I probably wouldn't go below 1080p and FSR on performance, to be honest. For better comparability, I was testing Overwatch 2 on an empty map with a specific walking route at 1080p with low settings and activated FSR. 89 FPS on average for the 13 watt profile, 123 FPS for the 17 watt performance mode, and 142 FPS on turbo. While in fighting scenes the FPS drops around 10 to 20%, but it is still playable just fine overall if you don't need like 200 FPS in this title to be successful. PUBG was playable okay at 1080p using the DirectX 11 mode and low settings. I saw an average of around 44 FPS for the 13 watt silent mode, around 52 FPS on average for the 17 watt performance mode, and 65 FPS on average for the 35 watt turbo mode, and you could get slightly higher FPS by using 900p or even 720p, as I did not use any upscaling here. For Red Dead Redemption 2, I was actually trying the hardware unboxed optimized settings in combination with FSR on quality, which resulted in 32 FPS on average using the 13 watt profile, 39 FPS for the 17 watt profile, and 45 FPS on average for the turbo mode. I also checked out if the 7 watt profile could handle the game at 720p with the lowest settings, and no, it couldn't really. Only 23 FPS on average in that case. You surely could achieve more FPS here by lowering the settings, but the hardware unboxed ones surely look pretty darn good. Rocket League was one of the few games that ran perfectly fine even with the highest possible settings at 1080p. I also tested it at 720p with low settings for the 7 watt manual profile first, which got me playable 69 FPS on average, so yeah, 6 hours of battery runtime possible here. For the 13 watt profile, it already was 100 FPS on average at 1080p Ultra, only slightly higher 114 FPS using 17 watt, and 123 FPS on average for the highest 35 watt profile, so plenty of options here. I also fired up the Shadow of the Tomb Raider benchmark at 1080p medium, as well as 720p low for the 7 watt manual profile. That one got me 32 FPS on average and 35 FPS on average for 1080p and medium settings using the 13 watt silent mode. Already 46 FPS on average for the 17W performance mode and slightly higher 51 FPS on average for the 35W turbo mode when plugged in. Skyrim ran just perfectly fine at 1080p and ultra settings. Already 54 FPS on average for the lowest 13W silent mode, 57 FPS on average for the 17W performance mode, while that one was already mostly hitting the 60 FPS cap, and 58 FPS on average for the 30W turbo mode. So there should even be some headroom for some graphic modding in this game. And you can also see that in this game the GPU utilization is way below 100% because of this 60 FPS cap, and then on the other hand the game is now I think already 15 years old, so it should not pose any problem to the Z2 Extreme. On the other hand, Starfield still is pretty demanding, and using my usual benchmark run through this big city gave me the following numbers. Only 23 FPS on average at 13W with 1080p and low settings plus FSR activated, 30 FPS on average for the 17W performance mode and 41 FPS on average for the 35W turbo mode. Quite disappointing to be honest, and further reducing the resolution is probably a good advice for this game. The same is true for Star Wars Outlaws. That one didn't work great yet at 1080p, low settings and FSR already unbalanced. Only 24 FPS on average for the 13W profile, 27 FPS on average for the 17W performance mode and just above 30 FPS for the 35W turbo mode. And even without recording, there is barely any difference here. So you'd really need to be okay with around 30 FPS, and I guess that's not optimal. The Tony Hawk Pro Skater 3 remake is nowhere as demanding and ran great at 1080p and low settings with FSR unbalanced. Already playable 48 FPS on average for the silent mode and 66 FPS on average for the 17W performance mode, as well as slightly higher 75 FPS on average for the turbo mode. So decent performance, and the game still looks pretty nice that way on the 7-inch Full HD screen for sure. I was testing The Last of Us 2 at 1080p with medium settings and FSR unbalanced. Not quite playable using the 13W mode with only 26 FPS on average. Though already 36 FPS on average for the 17W mode and around 43 FPS for the 35W turbo mode. So using low settings instead would probably be a good idea as well if you need more than around 45 FPS on average here. For the next two games I was once more also using the 7W manual mode. In Valheim that got me only 25 FPS on average at 720p in low settings though. Not playable unfortunately. At 13W and 1080p with performance settings that was a better 32 FPS on average. Already playable 40 FPS on average for the 17W performance mode and slightly higher 45 FPS on average for the 35W turbo mode plugged in. And Valorant worked perfectly fine even with the 7W manual mode. Already 151 FPS on average in that case when combined with 720p and low settings. At 1080p and low settings using the 13W silent mode I already saw 270 FPS on average, only slightly higher 295 FPS for the 17W profile and 312 FPS for the 35W mode. So going with either the 7W profile or the 13W silent mode is absolutely enough already, unless you're Chronicle himself and really need that extra 1 millisecond of input latency reduction. Watchdogs Legion is doable at 1080p with medium settings. 34 FPS on average for the 13W silent mode, playable 43 FPS on average for the 17W performance mode and higher 54 FPS on average for the 35W turbo mode. So I'd say let's jump to the two last games for today. First we got The Witcher 3, for which I used the older DirectX 11 version because that's working much better here. At 1080p and medium settings I saw 35 FPS on average for the 13W silent mode, already very playable 49 FPS on average, around 50 to 51 without recording for the 17W mode, and close to 60 FPS with 57 FPS on average for the 35W turbo mode. So 60 FPS are definitely possible with medium settings, and 900p, which still looks decent enough on the 7-inch screen of the Xbox LIX. And last but not least, I tried to benchmark World of Warcraft with a predefined run through Stormwind. For the 7W profile, I used 720p and the preset 5 out of 10, which is pretty much how I played the game at its release in 2005. They gave me 64 FPS on average. For the 13W profile, I saw 77 FPS on average, slightly higher 82 FPS for the 17W performance mode, and already 100 FPS for the 35W turbo mode when plugged in. Now, in most occasions, these FPS could be lower, especially in newer zones or raids, but we surely got plenty of options to further improve performance for this game, so absolutely playable on the Xbox Li X. So overall, the Z2 Extreme in the all-new Xbox Li X isn't that much of an improvement over the Z1 Extreme, but I guess many of you probably already knew that.
If you're, for example, a heavy user of the original ROG Ally 1 or the Lenovo Legion Go 1, the upgrade could still make sense, since the twice as big battery and the good efficiency can surely give you much better battery run times. Also, something I didn't talk about yet is the much better ergonomics of the Xbox Li X with its Xbox controller-like layout. It just is more comfortable. However, basically every existing lighter indie game out there will run just perfectly fine and very comfortable on this machine. That includes not only but the following games which I haven't tested in today's video: Diablo Immortal, Hollow Knights 1, Stardew Valley, Disco Elysium, Terraria, League of Legends, Dota 2, The Sims, Celeste, Dorfromantik, War Thunder, Path of Exile 1 and 2, etc. Also, for most newer games you really need those 24GB of RAM, so you can safely assign 8GB of VRAM while still having 16GB of RAM left for the system. However, with $1,000 the price is pretty high right now, while I'm sure it will drop significantly over time, or if you're willing to go into the used market in a few months. If you want, you can also check out my recent revisit of the original ASUS ROG Ally Next, which will be shown here. And that's all for today. If you found the video helpful at all, please give it a like to show your support, and that also helps a lot in making these videos in the future. Or just consider subscribing to the channel as well. Thanks, much appreciated. Also, thanks for watching. See you next time. Bye bye and tschüss.